it's fantastic to see such a big audience here tonight and people out there in VC. Folks who are joining us by VC, Leslie and Vicky at the moment, can I just ask you to ensure that you have your microphones muted for the course of the talk? You know that, but it's important that I just remind you of that. And please also, people with internal microphones, turn those off for the course of the talk as well. Very much welcome to this Centre for History seminar. I'm delighted, just in case you don't know who I am, I better introduce myself first. I had planned to say that, but then I kind of slightly forgot. I'm Dr. Ian Robertson. I'm one of the readers in history here at the Centre for History, responsible for organising these seminars. I must have done something really bad in my past life. And I'd be delighted to welcome you all to this talk. And I'm delighted in particular to welcome Susan Kruse here tonight to give the talk. For those of you who don't know Susan, she is the Education and Outreach...
Learning and Engagement.
Damn! They're almost the same things. Learning and Engagement Manager for Arch, which is the community archaeology group for the Highlands, one of whose principal kind of objectives is precisely what we're doing tonight. Community-focused, public-focused, but also liaising with academic folks. So here tonight, we're here to hear about connections in a Sutherland context between archaeology and history over 2,000 years, thereabouts. So if you'll, without further ado, I'll hand over to Susan. But what I've got to do is get her PowerPoint up first. So just bear with me for a moment whilst I mess that up.
So while Ian's doing that, I'll just say thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me here. This is a bit of a new learning curve for me, because I'm used to being at the front of the room where I can move my hands and wander around, but I have to stay here to look there. So I'm going to have to try to be very restrained for this
You
talk.
can stand up if you want. It's, the camera works. We can muck around with the camera if you want. Leslie and Vicky, can I just... folks out there in VC land, I see John's joined us as well. John, can I just ask, make sure your microphone is muted. Can everybody see the PowerPoint out there? Can folks see the PowerPoint? Fantastic. So, Susan.
Thank you very much. This is a talk I've been looking to try to work at looking at Highland heritage. And normally I do 10,000 years in an hour. So this I thought would be nice and relaxed. We'll go with the historical period. I'll only do 2,000 years. And of course it's turned out to be equally long and equally, because once you get a chance to expand on things, it just takes its time. But in the course of this hour, I'm just going to try to explore 2,000 years of basically Highland heritage, focusing mainly on this area. First thing I want to get past is the word archaeology. I mean, I do community archaeology. It's something I feel very strongly about. But we have this problem with this word, because a lot of people, especially historians, feel that archaeology means it's just below the ground. I use the definition that Scotland's archaeology strategy did, which is the study of humans that passed through its material remains. And so that means it's everything from our earliest settlers right through to modern times. So it does include historical research, it does include documents, it does include that, but the key, I suppose, is material remains. Archaeologists therefore have to reuse texts, we use place names, we look at standing buildings, we look at the ruins, we look at ancient monuments, we look at landscapes, we examine soils, we even look at wrecks. So it's taking the whole, everything basically to do with the landscape around it. The pictures I'm showing you here, as I say, are some of the examples. The one is a fantastic clay pipe that's from Dornoch, that's sitting there. It's down at History Links Museum, and you probably can't see it from the detail, but the underside that it rests on is a footballer kicking a football, and that's what's used for there. The bit at the bottom, it's probably too small to hear, but it's a new monument type that we identified in a course in Golspie, and it is a self-flushing public convenience. You put your shack over a burn. And it turns out that these are quite common. Dunrobin Castle had them in for their workmen. There was one in Och once we start looking for these and asking people, you start getting the information, the remains, or in this case, somebody had discussed it with him and my contact drew a sketch of it. So why is this coming about? The Scottish Archaeological Research Framework was devised in the early 2000s and culminated in 2012 with established experts in each of the chronological periods, working panels to come up with an idea of what do we know about this period? What are our gaps? What are the bits that we don't know about? Where should we focus research? And so it's a fantastic place to start. It's what I always start if I have to find out about a certain topic. How do I find out about what the Bronze Age metalwork is? I go into SCARF to get the snapshot there. It sets itself up chronologically, though it had a few cross-cutting themes like maritime. It's designed as what we call a wiki format, which basically means it's online, and it invites people to respond, to actually say, oh, since this was written, there's been a fantastic site at such and such a place. Well, nobody ever does, unfortunately, but the design was therefore it would be interactive. And I do recommend this as a place to start if you're interested, whatever period. I mean, I have to say the modern one, the one that covers the historical period, is probably the densest and the most difficult to work with, but it's a lot of themes. But this was quickly realised that although you have a national picture, there are regional pictures all throughout Scotland. And as we'll see today, a lot of the things I'll be talking about are things that are different from the national scarf. And there was the recognition that we needed regional ones. And Historic Environment Scotland is funding gradually a process of doing regional ones all throughout Scotland. At the moment, our Highland Butte is the only one that's finished. We have several that are on the go, including the Highlands one. All of them are different. There are different leads in each of the different ones. Our Highland Butte was done by Kilmartin Museum, so a museum focus to start with. The one down in the southeast Scotland is a contract that was sent out to a developer, contractors. So it was more of I suppose, an exercise by people who are used to looking at things like that. The Highland one is the first one that has a community focus. It's the idea of we're trying to get as many people involved in this as possible. And we're actually being held up as quite a unique example of how this can work. So what these regional scarfs are doing is we're looking at what is the same, what is exactly the same as the national. But what is different? Where are the differences that we have here? Where should we think about future research and future areas to investigate here in the Highlands? And by Highlands here, I'm meaning Highland Council area. You have to have a definition, and that's the borders we're given. And we've increasingly realizing we have to look at regional focus even within the region. So, for example, the picture I have here, which is not in our 2,000 years, it's a bit older than that, but it's an example of a stone circle that's near the mound. And it's one of the things, stone circles appear in the Highlands only in certain areas. You don't find them to the south. It really is basically from Tame to the north and over in the west. And so there are regional changes and differences that you find. With the exclusion of the Clava cairns, but we won't get into that because that's over 2,000 years old. The end result of this is at the end of this 3 years, we're going to have an up-to-date overview of Highland heritage from Paleolithic right through to modern times. So we started in June 2018 with a symposium that was held in Inverness, where we got a number of people to talk about their views of the period and invited other people's comments. We see here, we had the old post-its to find out what people knew and what they thought about. We'll be going for 3 years, so we're in the middle of year 1 at the moment. We're spending this year working on our data. Because what we realize is that basically until we assess what we know and see the gaps in that, we can't actually make a lot of meaningful discussions on that. And I'll get into that a bit more as we go through. We're also actively inviting both individuals, groups, anyone who has past projects they want to flag up or new projects they might want to do. And with universities, we are certainly flagging the fact that there are lots of good dissertation topics that could be on the go. So our structure that we have here is going to allow comparison with the national. We're going chronological because if you want to compare, it's a lot easier to do it that way. We're using our data to underpin it. We're using the Highland Historic Environment Record, the HER. Now this is Highland Council's database of all known heritage. And it's compiled in the council. It's freely available on the internet. It's by far and away the most complete of all the regions in Scotland. And it from the earliest right through to modern times. It is important because it's in the council. It's not in culture and leisure. It's not in any museums or any of the bits. It's in the planning department of the council. And that's because the HER is used in every planning application. And it's also why it's very important to get our data into it, because whenever a planning application comes on board, it's looking at that. The HER is really good for structures. It's really good for monuments. It is not very good for finds. And that's why one of the things that we have been doing now, and we've just started for the past 2 months, is going to museums and trying to get an idea of what key finds. 2 of the people in this room joined me today at Dunrobin Castle Museum, and we've just been going through their collection, trying to see what key finds, and they certainly do have wonderful finds. Why are finds important? Well, occasionally, finds can be the only bit of information you have about something in the past. The object on the right, bottom right there, is about that big. It's just a couple millimeters big. It's a piece of worked quartz. That's what's something called a microlith. Now, that's from the Mesolithic period. It's from about 3,000 BC, roughly, well, even older than that even. It'd be about 4,500 BC. And these are normally found along the coast. Well, that one was found near Botagarten. And so it's our only evidence of Mesolithic settlement inland in this area. So the finds could be absolutely crucial. And a couple of the other 2 we'll be talking about as we go on. So within each period, we've identified various categories to look at on the idea that we've tried to find whatever you think is important, we can fit it into this structure. So we'll look at settlements, we'll look at landscape patterns, we'll look at how buildings are built, we'll look at farming and fishing and gathering and evidence that way, we'll look at food and drink, we'll look at aspects of daily life that we can identify. Quite a big structure within that. There's also been a lot of work on the environmental evidence, and we'll again come over some of these, but this is really important now. A lot of pollen analysis, a lot of really scientific analysis show what was growing, what are people eating, what are the plants that are around, when does the peat form, all of this evidence that we can incorporate. Look at religion and ritual, industry and craft, look at areas of transport, that's both of goods and people, and looking at conflict. And within that, we thought we could pretty much cover all the major themes. So today, in the time I have left, we'll just look at the last 2,000 years. There's going to be lots of questions, because this isn't a final picture. This is the work in progress and trying to get us to think about what are the important questions. And at the end, I'll have an invitation for all of you here to help by either suggesting work that you might know about, studies that you might know about. It might just be as simple as just adding pictures of local sites and places around you, adding information to the historic environment, or you might even decide there's a new topic of research that you're quite keen to incorporate on here. So we're going to start, even though it's 2,000 years, I'm going to start in the Iron Age, because that's what here, when we start going into our historic period. The Iron Age is also when our period structure starts really breaking down, because what's happening down south in the Central Belt, what's happening up here in the Highlands. Traditionally, it's supposed to start from about 800 BC. Down in southern Scotland, they stop at about 600 AD because they have an invasion coming up from northern England. Up here in the Highlands, we don't have that, and some people would actually stretch it as far as 1000 AD. So we've got a situation of this at this time, quite a long period of almost 1700 years, where a lot of changes happen, a lot of structures and things that certainly in terms of housing, we find a lot of different housing. In terms of burials, at the very beginning of the Iron Age, we have no burials. And it's a difficult problem, is how are people buried at this point? And then over time, it's a time when Christianity will come. It's a time when we start getting into the Pictish period. It's the time of the Vikings coming. So quite a lot going on in this period. As I say, we've got a lot of settlement types at this point. We have round houses. The picture at the top right is Coduffel in Inverness, a fantastically rich site. It's going to be published next year. It's of national, if not international importance of what they're finding there. We have a lot of settlements on lochs, both sea and inland. For example, Loch Migdale, not too far from here, has a crannog in there. We have Broch sites, which again, certainly from here going north, you only have to go, probably Carnleath is one of the best preserved, that's right on the roads. We have a lot of hill forts and duns. So a lot of settlement evidence that we have for this period. And a lot of these settlements have given us a lot of material culture, the evidence of daily life. The picture at the right is some of the finds from Dunarchecht on Skye, which have exotics, including in the top, you'll see a pickaxe, which is probably a Roman object that's been traded up here, to hammerstones, to bits and pieces that way. So a lot of material evidence, not much of it diagnostic, so it means that we do need proper excavations. If you find a hammerstone, that could be thousands of years old. You need to find it in your context. We start to find bog butter at this point, and this really is it's wooden containers that are full of butter that are buried into peat, and they preserve amazingly well, and we've tested this out with the young archaeologists. So you just take your butter, put it in wood and stick it in peat for a year, and it's perfectly preserved when you come out. Children in Ireland have gone one further. They not only preserved their bog butter, but then they tested it, and by all accounts it was absolutely inedible, just absolutely horrible. Is this our 21st century palate just saying, this is not, because before refrigeration, this is one way to preserve? Or is butter being used in another way? Is it being used for lubrication and just being kept in there? Or, as being archaeologists, we eventually get down to, is it ritual? Is it some way of burying it down? And I have to say, in this case, given the Iron Age and the way so much of our ritual sites are going underground, I would probably opt for a lot of this as being a ritual. Fertility, working with that, but I can't ever prove it. We have, again, for our settlement, a lot of evidence in recent excavations that tell us about plants and growing, and this material has to be brought together. It hasn't been yet, and it's one of the aims of the project is to start bringing together some of this environmental evidence. We don't have many burials. As I say, it's a real mystery what's happening, just a few bones here and there. And again, you have to start thinking about what sort of burial right would you have if you don't deliberately bury your dead. So it's a case of not really understanding what's going on with the religion at this point. There is, however, a lot of ritual. High Pasture Cave, which are the plan and the picture at the bottom there, is a site on Skye, which is again of national and international importance. It was found by cavers going down an underground passage and found a ritual site that is just caches upon caches of objects, incredibly unusual, huge amounts of feasting going on, things that are put there deliberately. I mean, stones, rotary quairns, all placed in exactly the same way. There's something going on about underground passages and burying it there. It's also the first, I believe it's still the first evidence of a musical instrument where they have a bridge from a lyre that's been found down there. So again, High Pasture Cave on Skye showing just the sorts of ritual we have. We also have underground buildings, including a few not too far from here, Cider Hall as an example of these objects, these structures called souterrains, often attached to roundhouses. Most of them identified just by crop marks, very few surviving, but the jury's out on what they're for. We're back again. Are these for storing grain, because they often have grain in them, or are these ritual? I mean, it seems to me crazy to put grain into a damp underground structure if you want to preserve it, but maybe there were ways around that as well. Industry and craft, we've got, again, a fair amount of evidence coming here from the Highlands, and again, it's these recent excavations that are showing them. At the right, you can see bronze working furnaces from Caduthal in Inverness. Unheard of, to have that sort of structure. And what these are important because they're showing metal and metal objects are not just being imported here to the Highlands, but we're making them. They have the knowledge and the ability to make them. And they're making glass beads. These glass beads that we can see of the type at the bottom are being made at Culbin Sands near between Nairn and Burghead, and also at Caduthal as well in Inverness. So we have, again, these high status objects being made in certain areas within the Highlands. This is, of course, encompassing the Roman period. We have here in Scotland only 3 times that the Romans made it into Scotland, and yet we find Roman objects of various periods all throughout. I think the argument, my personal take on this, despite, as you see, the dots that we can see of finds at the Highlands, what we're seeing here is high status trade rather than the Romans actually being up here. I don't think the Romans made it to any part of the Highlands. What we have here, however, is high status objects like this set of bowls from Helmsdale, which is down in the National Museum in Edinburgh, which were for serving wine. Now, I don't think we have many grapes growing up here in the Highlands, but what we do have is these exotic objects, which if you're really wealthy and really have the ability, you can trade up to get them from the south. And we do have a number of these Roman objects and more being found, especially with metal detecting now every year. We've now taken, because there's so much happening within this long Iron Age, we can sort of identify from the early historic period. And this is really taking advantage of the idea that we have an Iron Age people, which about 300 AD, we have a name for them. And they're now called the Picts. They're not a new people coming in. They are just a name that the Romans have given the indigenous people within here in Scotland, and especially the ones living up here. So we have the Picts, and then around 800 we have the Viking invasions coming in here, and that's obviously affecting here. We have certain changes. We have Christianity coming at this point too, and that brings a whole another set of influences, and of course it brings literacy. So that's why, in terms of the historic period, we're talking about now having written texts, not many, but a few. So we'll look at some of these here. As I say, we have literacy. One of the most unusual and very enigmatic stones is the one that we see on the left from Tarbet, from Port Mahomet. That's a Latin inscription. That's a Latin inscription of a grave monument with a Christian text, and could only have been for a monk who was there at the monastery. So somebody is able to read, or you're not going to be able to put that up. But who else, other than those monks, could have read Latin? As we'll see, they were also making gospel books there. So we do have a literate tradition. The one at the right is a stone from Golspie, a picture stone from Golspie. And along the side, which you can't see there, but there is an inscription in Ogham, which is an alphabet that's come from Ireland. And again, probably related to Christian. So we do start to get limited literacy coming here. The Picts, first named by the Romans in 297. The ones at the top is two pictures of Picts. Those are from the 17th century, just as the discoveries in the New World have brought about the idea of the noble savage. And this is the way the Picts were interpreted at that point, these painted people that are there. Another interpretation is just below that, and it's a David Beckham lookalike that's in Elgin Museum. So obviously when this was set up, he was at his forefront. So he's there in all his glory. The Picts, we tend to apply this to the period between about 300 to about the 800s, when they're basically caught in the pincer movement. The Norse are coming from the north, the Dalriata Gaels are coming from the southwest, and the Picts lost a number of key battles and really got subsumed. There's a number of tribes, there's a number of kingdoms. It's not terribly well understood, partly because we have very few contemporary documents that talk about them. We do certainly, though, have a lot of myths about the Picts. If you've heard that they don't have an Indo-European language, that's a myth. We have no reason really to think that they're a matrilineal society. They certainly are not imports. They are not invaders who have come in. But over the years, a number of these myths have grown up. Of course, the most distinctive thing about the Picts are their stones, and we'll have a look at some in a moment. But I'll just point out the object that you can see at the bottom right there. That was found in Germany, and it's a dice tower. So you would put your dice at the top, and the baffles within it would make your dice come out at the bottom. And it has an open work inscription, which in Latin, which basically says something that the Picts are defeated, let us just celebrate. So even going from the troops going into Germany were knowing about the Picts and celebrating the fact that they were in conflict with them. Okay, looking at our categories, settlement for this period, this early bit of people, we basically have no idea where people are living, or very little idea. Certainly in the Highlands, there's nothing. A little bit further afield, we have a few high-status sites at Riney, which has recently been excavated. Burghead has some, but here in the Highlands, we don't know. There are some settlements that have recently been dated, well, recently in the last 20 years, over in Highland, Perthshire, which isn't that far from the southern Highlands. And then in a place called Pitcarmick, they have found rectangular houses which have been dated to the Pictish period. So we haven't found any yet, but there's a possibility that we will find similar ones. It just means we need more excavation and we need more dating for ones like that. We do find some places brocks tend to survive here. So a place like Carnleith up in Golspie, the brock was out of use, but what we find is inside they've taken some of the stone and built smaller, easily more heatable type of areas. So we do have a bit of reuse. But for daily life and trying to think about what's happening, we've tended to rely on the Pictish stones. The Pictish stones with their wonderful scenes like the Hilton of Cabell one there, which has the woman who's wearing her Pictish brooch who's going off on a hunt. And was this what old high-status women did, is one interpretation, or, as Isabel and George Henderson have argued, a lot of what you see is really coming out of the post-Roman tradition. And so they're showing scenes that are in post-Roman society that have come up with gospel books, that have come up with that. And so they may not represent contemporary Pictish society, but more of a post-Roman society. I think it'd be hard to, you don't want to give up all the bits and pieces you have in these scenes. And they certainly are stories, a lot of them. The symbol stones, I'm not going to talk in great, we don't have time really to do, but a lot of them just have symbols. A lot of them have crosses, obviously when Christianity comes in. A lot of them have stories. There's something going on there. Other places that we have for religion and burial, we start getting a few long kists, what we call, basically stone boxes, coffins. But unlike the Bronze Age, where they were short and the body had to be crouched, these are for laying out. The problem is that very few of them have grave goods. So unless we have a skeleton, and unless we can date them, we can't actually know for sure. But there's a lot of work that's being done on this now, and I think the next few years something will emerge. Some of these are in what we've identified as potential Pictish cemeteries because they have square barrows and round barrows. And the one you can see, which obviously doesn't show up in this small scale here, that's from Whitebridge. But quite exciting is in Taradale, which is near Muirvord. There's going to be a community excavation this summer. And so anybody who wants to have a go at excavating at a potential Pictish cemetery site is welcome. And if you are, just have a word with Anne at the end of this and she can give you more details, or look at the Taradale Through Time website. One thing we do in terms of religion and ritual, and this has been shown absolutely categorically, is that we have a monastic site very close to here at Port Mahomack. It's not alone. There's another one at Rosemarkie, but that hasn't been excavated. But the one at Port Mahomack really gives us an idea of what monastic settlement was, and including what the monks ate. We have very good environmental. It gives us a huge amount of information there. Christianity itself is, in Scotland in general, is quite a complicated process. It has really three strands that are coming in here. We have an Irish strand coming, which a lot of, especially for up here in the Highlands, is the main one. These monks who come over from the west and then work their way across, founding small cells, founding churches and missionary posts here. St. Columba is obviously the one that is the most famous, but there are a number of others who have, and some of the dedications show. Down in the south, we have another tradition that's basically coming from Rome, coming over with the Anglo-Saxon communities, and then it works its way up to Northumbria and then further up to here. And during the Pictish period, we do have a certain amount of interaction that's happening. According to Bede, King Nectan in the 700s sought to reform the Columban church with the Northumbrian church up here in Pictland. We can certainly see, however, from some of the architectural and sculptural styles that the Northumbrian tradition is making its way up here. I mean, as we'll look at the Hilton of Cadwallstone with its decoration, has a lot that's in common. And they found a Northumbrian coin as well in the excavations. The third strand is what we call the British strand. Whithorn seems to be the main. It has a separate sculptural tradition, not a huge amount that's known about it, and certainly for up here in the Highlands, not a great deal. Having said that, Farron Abbey later on had strong connections to Whithorn, so it's a complicated situation. At Tarbet, our monastic settlement there certainly was showing a Pictish monastery that was there, founded about the 6th century. At about the 800, something catastrophic happened. There was huge burning, a lot of destruction, sculpture destroyed. Did the Vikings destroy it? Well, I think they would say yes, but it's not necessarily. I will only point out, you only have to look at some of the Irish sources for this period to see that a lot of the attacks on Irish monasteries were being done by local Irish lords who were also trying to. So it's not 100% sure on that, but the timing's about right. One of the things you can see at the bottom there is the remains of a stretcher for vellum. They found tools for vellum. They found style for writing. There was obviously manuscripts that were being written there. And that's an incredible new for us. I mean, for years there were always these outliers and people would say, oh, there must be a scriptorium in Easter Ross or up in the East Coast. And this is the proof that there was. We can't identify any of the gospel books with it, but they are making them up here. It also becomes later the focus for medieval church, and we'll come a bit to that when we get to the medieval period. It had a precinct, clearly then, and Martin Carver, the excavator at Tarbet, is arguing that these main crosses, we have the Hilton of Cadboll, we have the one Nig stone in Nig Church at present, and the Shandwick stone, which is still in Shandwick on its original location, were high crosses that were meant to show the precinct of the monastic settlement of the time. There's also bits and pieces of others that are destroyed that may have been part of that as well. Beautiful tradition, very three-dimensional. You can see the Nig stone in particular is like metalwork just transposed onto stone. We have other sculpture around here. It's not just these. There's a wonderful collection in Dunrobin Castle Museum. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend going to see it because it was brought in the 1800s. Lots of the local pieces that were there were brought in, and they were brought inside. Now, yes, we've lost them in their original context, but we preserved the actual. If they were left out, most of them are sandstone, and they would completely go. So we have good collection from Sutherland that is being held in Golspie. Tarbet itself is phenomenal. I mean, there's hundreds of fragments during the excavation, and some of it really high status. Easter Ross has its own. There's the Etterton stone as well, or one of the Etterton stones illustrated there on the left. Caithness has a number of really nice stones. I just point out there is a gap for Dornoch. There ought to be picture stones from here, and there isn't. And it could just be, these things happen. Stones get reused especially. But it is noticeable that both Dornoch and Tain, the places you would expect to find, and we don't find them at the moment. So keep looking in those dikes. Other evidence of religious activity in this period can be place names and dedications to early Christian missionaries, but these are very impossible, very difficult to date, very difficult to determine anything else. Most of them are dependent on early documents, and that's the one thing we really lack here in the Highlands, is a lot of early documents. There's not that many. There is the possibility that holy wells might date back to this period, might even date back to the pre-Christian period. Would be difficult to date, but it would be nice to have a holy well, just to have maybe a site or two that would have possibly a good stratigraphy around it to see if we could get some dating for when it was in use. The one I've shown there is from Helmsdale. It's just one of a number. Obviously, that's much later in this building there. In terms of craft and industry, well, certainly there is high-class sculpture work being done at Tarbet. I mean, that is just one of the examples of some of the many fragments that were there, showing top-notch sculptures that are working in the Christian milieu, but certainly working there. Metalworking, again, Port Mahomet, after it stops, while it's a monastery, there's metalworking going on, but after the putative Viking raid in 800, we have metalworking continuing. And Martin Carver argues at that point it is not monastic, it is secular. You could argue it slightly differently as well, but there's certainly metalworking going on. Dornoch itself, at the business park and places around here, we found evidence of metalworking from this period as well. Picture on the right, that's whether it was made here, I don't know, but that is a pin with a picture of a man on it. And that was found. If there's any justice in the world, this is one of them. This was a woman who spent her life researching local history in Golspie, and that's what she found in her garden. And so it's just wonderful, wonderful find. We have two of the Rogart brooches. There was a whole horde of them found when the railway was doing, very distinctive type that's in the Pictish period. Very, obviously, elite. It's gilt. It's got precious stones. The difficulty is knowing, are these imports or were they made locally? There's no way we can tell at the moment until we get the metalworking evidence. Burials, again, it's an emerging story. As I say, these long-kissed cemeteries are starting to come in, and barrow cemeteries as well. From about 800, we have the Vikings coming in. Our problem with the Viking evidence is there's virtually no archaeological settlement, houses being done by the Vikings until about 1200, we know the settlers are here, we just cannot find where they are. And it's the place names in particular can show us both settlement but also administrative areas. Thing names, the thing was the assembly of free people, the free men. And Dingwall is the classic one, but there are other thing names that are in the Highlands. The hoards, such as the Tarbet hoard, which dates from about 1000 AD, that is showing us linking into the whole Viking world, basically. These are the sorts of things that you would find in Scandinavia, but you will also find in Ireland, you will also find them in northern England. It links them, you'll find them in the Baltic. So we have structures and ones going along that way. There's still lots of questions, and one of the ones in terms of the Vikings is who's controlling East Sutherland? What is happening around here? I think this is our frontier. This is where our place names from the Dornoch Firth to the north is where you find the most. And archaeologically, for the finds, you find virtually nothing. I mean, we'll assume that Tarbet, is just across the water. But further south, Dingwall, for all the years it has spent, has never found a single Viking artifact. It's just simply, it seems to be at here. And also, the evidence we're finding around here is of settlement in terms of grave goods. The object that you see on the left is one of a pair of oval brooches, and that's from Ospesdale, so not that far from here, and must be a disturbed Viking grave for a woman. The axe down below may be a Viking axe. The haft is obviously more modern, but that could be a male grave as well. There are some objects that are from Dunrobin that suggest we might have also a disturbed grave there. And at Dunrobin Castle, you also have the undershells of two of these oval brooches. So we do have Viking graves. And Viking graves means, women Viking graves means these are people who are settling. These aren't just your raiders coming in. Two of the really exciting finds most recently, you would be forgiven for not being terribly impressed with on the first glance. The middle one, as you can see, is 2.5 centimeters long. It's tiny. That is the end bit of one of these distinctive type of arm rings. It's a Viking arm ring, and they were used basically for currency and bullion. You could wear your wealth, but if you needed to, you chopped it off, and it went into the scale pan. And that's what we're seeing. But this is one of the very few that's been found, not in a hoard, but this is a metal detecting find from not too far from where we're sitting today. And the one beside it, which is even smaller, is another little bit of cut silver, what we call hack silver. You can see it's been cut up, it's been nicked around, and it was basically used for the scale pan. And I think taken together, where we have these oval brooches, we have possibly disturbed graves, we have economic activity, we have here a Viking presence. We do have to remember that the hoard from Port Mahomet is dated to about 1000. So it's not the earliest settlers, it's not the 800s. This is 200 years after that. So we're talking, 5-6 generations later. So we have an interesting and sort of fairly long term. And I suspect we have here sort of the limit of control of the Vikings as they're heading to the south. Conflict for this period, well, we've got documentary evidence of not much, but we do have a few Irish annals that mention things that are happening over here. Bits and pieces. It's fairly sparse. It's fairly ambiguous. I think what we have is a situation where we have a lot of conflict between who's ever there and people trying to take control of territories. So we'll have Norse who are fighting the Picts, who are fighting the Gaels, as well as local ones as well. The sketch at the bottom is from the Shadwick Stone, not too far from here, again showing you can tell that there's some fighting going on, two warriors on the left with their swords. And the wonderful Swano Stone in Moray, at Forres, on the right. In the middle, it's probably too small to see here, but what we have are headless corpses that are stacked up. You've got a story there. You've got a story of a major battle that happens. It's just nobody knows what the story is. Environmental evidence, again, we just need to pull this together, but the excavations of Port Mahomet and the recent excavations we've had here in Dornoch have produced a lot of good information. And it really is now a question of trying to figure this out. It didn't tell us what crops are growing at the time. What are they eating? Which kind are they eating? Oats, barley, what are they growing? What vegetation is around? Is there woodland? Is it chopped down? All of this information is starting to come through, and it's telling us about the climate. Is it warmer? Is it colder? And we do find shortly after this that we do have a cold spell. We've got to keep moving. Medieval period, 1100 to 1500 here, roughly speaking. A time of real differences here from what's happening down south. The national scarf picture just does us no service at all for the Highlands, because we have 3 different strands here in the Highlands. It took me years to figure this out. It's fairly obvious when you think about it. We have the Norse in the north. So 800 is our first raids. Gradually they consolidate. We have a kingdom, an earldom in Orkney and Shetland. And they come over into Caithness as well and move down into Sutherland. But it's a bit unclear how far in Sutherland they're coming. So we have the Norse there. Over in the west, we have the Lords of the Isles, who start out as basically simplified an amalgamation of Norse settlers there with some of the Gaels who'd been there, creating a power structure that is totally autonomous from the Scottish kingdom. The Scottish kingdoms could not keep track of them until they were suppressed, is the word that we tend to read in history books, in the late 1400s. So they're doing their own thing as well. And at times, the Lords of the Isles will control all the way over. So Rossshire was actually for some years part of the Lordship of the Isles. So again, you have to picture a fluid situation. But of course, if you read the history books, that's not what you get at all. If you read the history books, it's all Scottish kings. And you can see them coming up. The map at the bottom is where those royal boroughs are being established slowly. And if the years were against those dots, you would see how we're watching them marching up, the Scottish kings coming up, giving out land. Those landed people establish castles, establish boroughs, create their structure, and then move on. But the sharp-eyed of you will see that there's not many dots really north of the Black Isle. It takes a long time for the Scottish kingdoms to work their way. So we have a very different structure in the Middle Ages here. And I think a lot of toing and froing. And much of the Highlands is frontiers, is being fought after as frontier areas. In terms of where they're living, the same problem with the Vikings we find in this Norse period. We just simply do not know where they're staying, where the houses are, with 2 exceptions. Borley, which is over near Durness. They found some dating evidence there and a settlement there. And Freswick in Caithness, there's good evidence of Norse houses. But that's it. And so the arguments now are then, well, they must be under existing houses. And it may well be, because where else would they be? Unless they've all been ploughed out. For the south, it's obviously easier, because if castles leave a bigger imprint, come into the documentation. And we're very lucky that a couple of the castles, including Erkut Castle and Inverlochy Castle, both have a lot of finds from excavations there. So we can recreate a lot of the daily life of the elite in those places. But what about the places elsewhere? What about the people who aren't the elite? And that's the ones that are hard to find. And this is where Port Mahomet really comes into its own. The excavations of Port Mahomet, yes, was a Pictish monastery, but it also encompassed the medieval period. And there's lots of interesting finds coming out of that, both the daily life, but also things like the men in Port Mahomet had a more meat diet than the women, which is basically, again, a preferential social treatment on who is getting the prime. And this is done by isotope analysis. So there's a lot of interesting things that are happening with there. Cromarty is the one that's really going to tell us a lot there, because the excavations at Cromarty, which are still being written up, show a thriving trading settlement and a fantastic amount of information about medieval settlement at a borough level. We're finding, even though it's not a royal borough until way after the medieval period, it clearly is important in the Middle Ages. Because the settlement had shifted, we can see they had large-scale excavation, and they didn't have to worry about other buildings to a great extent. And they've identified local pottery that's being made there, imports a huge amount of information, and when the excavations are published, it should be absolutely fascinating. So what sort of finds do we find from this point? Well, coins. Coins are not generally Scottish coins. They tend to be a lot of English coins, but they give us a fair amount of movement of people. A type of brooch, a round brooch called an annular brooch, which is really popular here in the Highlands. And again, we're starting now to build up a picture to be able to show the maps. But everybody wore these. And it seems to be, if you couldn't afford silver, which most couldn't, it was copper alloy. You had a copper alloy type. We find dated quernstones. We find bits of jewelry. The bits at the bottom, you can see, the left. The dull one is something that recently came up here in Dornoch, and that is a buckle which has animal heads at the end. And you can see them biting. And I show you the picture on the right, which is from Aldern. It's almost identical, but the Aldern one is silver. So we have a local tradition being used there. We possibly, this is just recently just found there may even be a medieval body that was found at Rogart, a bog body. That some of the hair apparently and some of the clothing was supposed to be medieval. I don't know, we're still trying to track down the references to this. I suspect nothing survives, but it's really interesting to think that we might have actually a body that was from there. This is where we're going through the museums, we're looking through treasure trove archives, we're trying to compile the list of what we've got. Pottery, for example, that's some of the pottery on the right that's from the Dornoch Business Park. This is just a sample of some of the metal detector finds from Dornoch. You have some of the most active metal detecting going on, and a lot of it very, very reputable. I mean, they're reporting their finds, they're reporting what's there. We have annular brooches, we have buckles, we have huge amounts of spindle whorls there, we have a seal, lots of finds there, and this is really giving us a picture of probably more of the daily life that we would find from most places. That we have hotspots of metal detecting throughout the Highlands, and Dornoch is certainly one of them. History Links Museum has bid and got a lot of these, and they're exemplary in that they put it online. There is an online presence for a lot of their finds, unlike any place else in the Highlands. A lot of the Dornoch finds are also down in Inverness Museum and Art Gallery. And of course we have the Plaid Mill, another example of what's trade and things that are happening that way. We don't have many medieval churches in the Highlands, it has to be said. The best preserved one is the one at the bottom right, and that's Crosskirk up in Caithness. But arguably that is a Norse church, because at that point that was still part of the Kingdom of Norway. So it gradually works its way. The one at the top right is Kiltern near Edmonton, and what we're all pointing to, and what you can't see on this small screen, that is a medieval window that's been built into a post-Reformation church. So we start seeing bits and pieces of that. We do start to get documentary evidence as the time goes on. Not a huge amount, but enough there. We do find a few medieval gravestones, one of which, the picture there is an unusual one from Thurso, which has a runic inscription. Just again showing this long tradition of the Norse there. Holy wells probably are thriving at this period, but again, it all depends on documentation to tell us, since we have no dating. And we have a handful of monastic settlements. In all of the Highlands, there are not many. The furthest north is the one at the bottom, which is Ferns. So it's very different from what's happening down south, where you have a lot of people founding monastic monasteries for the goods of their soul. That doesn't happen up here, with a few exceptions. For cathedrals, this is something that the organization of the church begins with David I. Dornoch becomes the See of Caithness. It was Hallkirk before it was Dornoch. Obviously, it was harder to control, and they got as far south as they could, basically, to control the See of Caithness. In Rossshire, it was Rosemarkie and then moved to Fortrose. But interestingly enough, Inverness, which is the big centre now and was important in the medieval period, is not a church centre. That is Elgin. It is Elgin that is the see there. So we have here examples of seals that we can find. A crozier found at Fortrose in one of the medieval tombs that are there. So our first documentary reference to this area is a writ by David I, recorded in the Dunfermline Abbey Register, ordering Wrongvild, the Earl of Orkney, to respect the monks at Dornoch. Now, there's lots of questions. That even that, what are these monks doing here in Dornoch? Are these just traveling monks who are traveling through? Is there a monastic settlement that simply disappears? No one knows, because that's all we have. We have this seal matrix of James, the chaplain of Dornoch, from about the 13th to 14th century, but nothing else is known about James. Again, as I say, the borough isn't even recognised as a royal borough until 1628. So what's happening here in Dornoch is still, despite being the sea, is still very much a subject of interest. In terms of other ones, however, Tain really stole the show for the area, because they got St. Duffic. And St. Duffic was one of the, we don't know much about the saint, but we do know that his pilgrimage site was incredibly important. And by the 15th century, James the Fourth, yes, was visiting there almost every year of his reign. So huge amounts of that, and his relics were there, his head, his breastbone, his shirt, his cup, his bell, his staff, none of which survive. If you went on pilgrimage, you got a little badge to show, and the badge I'm showing there is actually from Finlagen. It was for somebody who went on pilgrimage to Rome and brought back one from there. Be interesting. I don't know if anybody's actually sent any pilgrim badges from Tain, but it would be interesting to sort of see if there's anywhere any things like that. Industry and craft, well, there's very few remains that we could firmly date to this period. We're going to try to, obviously there's bits and pieces of references we've got to pull together. Documentary references, again, there's scope for getting more historical evidence for what's happening here. We do have some evidence of metalworking from Dornoch. We do have evidence of local pottery tradition that's come out of the excavation. So we're starting to build this picture, but it's still very much in the early stages. Conflict, well, yes, we've got fortified settlements, we've got castles. It would be good to actually try to pick through some of the documentary references. Our problem with a lot of conflict is you'll find in clan histories talks of battles that happened in the medieval period and no indication about where they got this information. So it's a lot of legendary material that comes into us there. Skelbo Castle is a nice fortified one there. 14th century remains apparently of the existing one, but we know it's there in 1290 when the Scottish commissioners stopped there on their way north to fetch the Maid of Norway. As I say, environmental evidence, men are eating more meat than women in Port Mahomet. So, you can tell that, but we need to actually find more of the environmental. Right, in the few minutes I have left, we will do the rest of go from the post-Reformation there. I thought I was going to have so much time on this. No, the Reformation to Industrial Revolution is often, from an archaeological point of view, one of the ones that we have the least number of remains. But of course, it's the one where the historical documents start increasing at this point. And then when we look at the Industrial Revolution to the 21st century, that's really most of what we see when we look outside. And so I'm going to do a very, very swift, broad sweep of the sorts of things that we look at when we think of these periods. With settlements, we're looking at elite settlements. We have lots, obviously. We start with our tower house castles at the beginning of the period, and we end up with structures like Dunrobin Castle towards the end, and lots of everything in between. But what about everybody else? Where are they living? Well, if you walk the landscape, you can certainly see lots of derelict settlements. Some of them have been cleared. Some of them have simply been abandoned. Very few of them have been excavated. So although we can see the structures, we don't know a huge amount about what these people were living at. And I think we could use a few more excavations of actual settlements there. We do have a lot of good sources. We have wonderful maps in Scotland. Anybody who hasn't looked at the National Library of Scotland website, I strongly recommend doing it. The map evidence you can trace is fantastic in that. We start getting good historical documents and good estate documents for certain places. And there's a lot and real potential to link these documents with the maps, with what's on the ground. And there's a huge scope that could be done on that. Even just taking an assessment, what key research has been done on settlement in this period? There's not a lot of pulling it together could be done. And there is certainly scope for a lot of more local research. This is an example of a map from Robert Gordon, on the National Library for Scotland website, 1636 to 1652. And lots of evidence of places and settlements. Place names that no longer exist, places that do exist, but you can trace a lot of these settlements what's going on. And it shows, for example, that it's the rivers. No surprises, still remains the rivers are the way you get around. This is the Roy maps, 1747 to 52. First large-scale mapping that we find that's on a global scale, that's on all of Scotland scale. It has its bias. The reason why is there. The dates are not accidental, 1747 to 52. It's a time when General Roy was going to make sure that if there was ever a problem again, he would know exactly where the settlements were and exactly where the routeways were. And so the real reason, he doesn't mention so many churches as he does settlements that we see. But scaling, map scale on that is just fantastic. And then various estate maps that we start getting. These are part of the Sutherland estate maps that are down, again, on the National Library for Scotland website. This is the Kirk map of 1773 for Golspie. There should be more coming up. At the moment, there are only a few, but the intent, I believe, is to get more of the Sutherland maps up on the website there. Settlement remains, well, we've got lots. We've got some crook-framed old structures there. We have farmsteads, places around railways. We have sleeper buildings. Now, this we find a lot of them, for example, in Badenoch and Strathspey. We ought to find some around here as well, given the railway that's there. But it's quite interesting to... most of them have been rendered. So a lot of time it's actually just asking around. We find corn kilns in every rural settlement. We find examples of model farms, places where rich landlords have made special things. There's a wonderful model dairy out near Spinningdale. Sheilings of all different shapes and sizes that are being used for the transhumans. Stills for herding your animals. Dikes and fencing. We're losing a lot of our stone dikes to the barbed wire and post fencing. And some of these really need to be recorded because they are land divisions. Interesting local as well, we've got this steam ploughing, which was something for there. It was a local innovation promoted by the Duke of Sutherland. Huge investment and hugely unsuccessful. But you can still see some of the remnants where the steam ploughing occurred, especially out towards Lergway. Public buildings, well, you could just, lots that could be studied on any of these, from banks, schools, hospitals, shops, hotels, village halls, lots of there, including our public conveniences. Artifacts and aspects of daily life, again, lots to be seen. Ice houses and ducats, really for the rich, coming through. Some of the, for example, ducats will go into the medieval period, but the ones that we have tend to survive from this period onwards. Ice houses, again, are starting to disappear. It's something we really should be recording, a lot of those. Sport, in terms of, one of the things I do local heritage courses throughout the Highlands. And I've now learned the two questions I ask every community I go into. The first one I ask is, where's your Neolithic stone axe? Because they will all have them. And the second one is, where was your curling pond? Because it's almost certainly has been destroyed. They were very popular. Sometimes, as at the bottom here, at least we have old photographs here of one that was local. Pavilions are almost entirely gone, but it's well worth doing. Maps often will show them as well, but local tradition is also very good. Obviously, golf will leave its impact as well, and I know that there's been a lot of work here at UHI on the golf. So the sports and the evidence of sports is there. Clay pipes, another one I think we really need. I always thought clay pipes were something that happened further south. Well, we're starting to find bowls, like the bowls of the pipes, with local inscriptions. And so it's something that certainly a study is needed. I think I've almost convinced a University of Edinburgh undergraduate to do it for a dissertation and to have a look at some of these. And just to see not only the actual remnants of the pipes and the dating of the pipes, but also the social structure. Who is it that's getting pipes? And who is it that's smoking? And then where did they get the tobacco? Apparently they paid some of the townhouse personnel in Inverness in pipe tobacco. So we've got a social history there as well. Pottery traditions, farming and fishing. I mean, we could go on, but it's key just to think, what are the key finds that we need to think that date to this period that can give us an idea of what's happening? There is evidence for the less well-off. We've got here an act for establishing correction houses for idle beggars and vagabonds. This is from 1672, and this is the one for Dornoch. That they give them a badge or a ticket to ask alms at the dwelling houses of the inhabitants of their own parish. And I couldn't find an example of a beggar's badge from Dornoch. There must exist somewhere. But what I do have here is an illustration of one from Croy. And you see it gives them a number and the date, 1742 in this case, for somebody who had the permission, therefore, to beg in that parish. There must be some of those for Sutherland. I haven't found any yet. Most of our parish churches, of course, date to this period, but we've got other churches as well. A lot of these will only appear on maps. To find them, we have various preaching sites where there was no church, and of course for that we're dependent on documents and local tradition. We have gravestones, wonderful gravestones from this period. The one at the bottom there is from Eventon, but I'm sure that there's equally interesting ones up here. We have watch houses. Watch houses. This is a concern for people that body snatchers were going to take the bodies, and they built houses on the churches so that they could watch and make sure just after someone was buried. Now, these appear in some of the most remote locations in the Highlands where there couldn't possibly have been a body snatcher that would get away with taking a body and getting out. But, I mean, they do appear, and it was obviously a concern of the time. And so one example is one at Lothmore, but they do appear all throughout the Highlands. Communion tokens, again, an example of something you would need for your church, and we do have examples. Dunrobin Castle, we were looking today, have really nice examples. Unusual one that we know of around here that I haven't seen elsewhere, but the picture at the bottom left is reputedly a coffin stand. When you think you had to take your body to the church for burial, and it was often a long way in some of these remote places, and so you would have these basically stands that you could place the coffin as you're walking. That's supposed to be near Dunrobin Castle. I've never seen it. I've looked out for it on the road.
It's not there anymore.
Right, it's not there anymore. That could be why. But it's always, generally there's a story as well about a watercourse that's nearby, and generally there's a story about a witch. And so there are a lot of traditions that have grown up about, the people drinking whiskey as they're putting down the body and going on. But there's certainly a part of the religious belief here. Craft and industry, well, we've got lots here in the Highlands, lots around here. Grain mills, sawmills, thrashing mills, fabric mills, boring mills. We find these in Badenoch and Strathspey for boring out holes in logs to be used at pipes in London. Spinningdale, it was a fascinating site as well. It was meant to be a social enterprise, basically. A huge amount there, but like many of these large ones, didn't really take off. Quarries and mines, Brura especially, we're looking at the salt pan excavations there on the right. Fantastic information that they found in those community excavations. People think that industrial archaeology is in the south. It is not. There is a lot of industrial archaeology in the Highlands. For everything from lime kilns, well, we have the earliest blast furnaces in Scotland are here in the Highlands out west. So there's a huge amount there, some of which is relatively modern. If we look at the fabrication yards, when I moved here over 20 years ago, and the Ardrosir was on the go, it was enormous. I thought, well, of course that's going to be there. Well, you'd be hard put to realize that there was something there. Things can disappear that you think are permanent. And a lot of these we should be recording, we should be getting the stories, we should be looking into them. Things like at the bottom, that's the rope works in Cromarty. And there's a lot of globalization that happens at this point. Getting your raw materials from Russia and then spinning them or making them into rope and then shipping them off elsewhere. Lots of stories there. Just a plug, if anybody is interested in industrial archaeology, the wonderfully named FEW panel is coming up here this year, the panel for historical engineering works, and they're going to have a visit to East Sutherland in July, and people are welcome to come either for one day or all the days, and they'll be going through a number of these. Transport, road network, at last we start seeing a road network from the 1700s. We start with the military roads, and then we have Telford, and Telford is one of the most influential, phenomenally influential people for the Highlands. After him, we had a road network and carriages could get out. And it transformed, absolutely transformed economies where he worked. And he worked all over the Highlands, not just east. He did a lot on Skye. He went even up to northwest Sutherland. So there's a lot of impact there. We have local landowners, some who are more proactive than others, and a story to be brought through. Some local trackways have always existed, and this is the real importance of talking to people, asking them about trackways. That picture there is near Carbridge, and I suspect it's gone now, without having the local knowledge and somebody taking a picture and telling us when it was used. We have remains of road transport. We have obviously various bridges. What you're looking at the top is an arch project to record, which was an unrecorded Telford Bridge near Lairg. Before this, it was simply not known about, and so we made the survey and have recorded that one, a very well preserved one. We have inns that emerge out of this network. We have milestones still to be found, some of which are more recent than others. We have toll houses. That picture on the bottom right is the toll house at Tain, which is just off the A9, just after the Asda. And last time I went by, it was looking in a pretty sad state. It was boarded up, and I'm really wondering whether it's going to survive. But that is an original Telford, and there is a picture that we have of it in use at earlier times. Toll houses weren't really successful in Sutherland. This is Robert Southey writing in 1819. He's a friend of Telford, and he does a visit up here. And he says the county of Sutherland begins on the left side of this water. He's talking about Bonar Bridge, where they put a toll house. The toll house did not suffice to pay the man who kept it. And he sued the county for wages, and a refractory person denied their right of imposing a toll and offered to contest it. And as a result, the toll collapses. Helmsdale, the tollkeeper, made more money selling whiskey than he did collecting tolls, and so he gave up. Tolls were not a success here. And of course, we have stories about ferries. Ferries are so important to this area. Don't really have time to talk about more than just sort of saying the Mickle Ferry disaster had such an impact for this area, a loss of over 100 people. And it's the reason that Telford built bridges. Bonar Bridge was built because of the Mickle Ferry disaster. Canals, well, we all know about the Caledonian Canal that Telford built, but did you know he built one in Dingwall as well? There it is, in all its glory. It silted up almost as soon as it was built. About the same time, Patrick Seller of the infamous fame there, he's building a canal just to the north of here. Our railways revolutionized our transport as well, and arguably you could get around better in the early 1900s by train than you can do now. I mean, the fact that you could get to Dornoch by railway, the fact that you could get through a lot of areas. Admittedly, we're talking east rather than west because there weren't many over in the west, but still hugely influential. Conflict, well, we've got documentary accounts of feuds. What you can't see on the OS map there is a talk about this is where the battle between the men of Caithness and Sutherland took place. So we've got bits of their battlefields. We have some. We may not have something of the stature of Culloden up here, but there's certainly enough of them that are known throughout the Highlands. War memorials have recently obviously been much in the news, especially with World War I, but we also have a lot of drill halls, of which I think Golspie has one of the finest when you look at it. So, and the drill halls date before World War I, and again, it's something that there's a project to try to record the ones we have. Cold War, the wartime years, this story needs to be gathered and it needs to be researched while we have the remains and while we have the people. I say this every year, and I've been saying this for 10 years, and we've completely lost it for World War I. We had for a long time, and we've almost lost it for World War II. One good example on the bottom left, this is the Inchen Down oil tanks from World War II that were built in the hillside above Invergordon to fuel the fleet. And the woman who's standing there is in her 90s, and she came to a course that we were having, and she said, "Oh yes, I used to work there." She was one of two women who was working at the oil tanks in the admin, and she'd never been up to the tanks the whole time. So we took her into them, and she finally got to actually see what the inside of the oil tanks, and she'd spent all that time. And that's one of the very few times, but she is a woman in her 90s who's sharp as a bell, and we really need to, we do need to get these wartime memories, and the remains are going as well. They have no legal protection, most of these. We have World War I and World War II forestry camps. We have a lot of these around here. We have at Argyll, those are World War I US foresters coming in here. Up here, we had, the bottom is recently emerged in 2016, the Newfoundlanders camp that was at, just outside of Golspie. We also had Hondurans. And there's another interesting social story, is how these black men who came to cut down trees and the discrimination they faced. And some of them said that they found it better in the Highlands. that there was more, they were more accepted here than they were further south. We have investigated a Canadian forestry camp, and this is actually something that's really key. We have now determined, if you're going to find a Canadian forestry camp, what should it look like? Those little undulating bits on the top left is actually part of a railway, and the aerial photograph shows the railway system that was moving the logs around. We identified the pond there. We identified the sawmill on the bottom right. We identified their rubbish, including a spittoon that dates to the time. But it means now with this that we can go out and we can identify on the ground a camp there. We have lots of wartime defences, especially going from the Mound over to Lairg. This was a key area. This was supposed to stop the Germans in this area. And so we do find pillboxes. We find road and rail blocks, a roadblock there in Invercarn. We do have gun emplacements. We have a lot of wartime remains, again, that need to be recorded. And we have military installations in various places all around here, right from World War I, World War II, and the post-war, the ROC posts that we see, the map at the bottom where they are. So we have, the bottom right is a World War I detonator store that you've probably gone by many times on the A9 at Dalmore Distillery, and that still survives. So we haven't even mentioned follies, we haven't mentioned special settlements, we haven't mentioned wolf traps, we haven't mentioned lots of other things, but hopefully what you've got from here is a real sense of how much there is out there. There's lots that's known about, and there's lots still to find out about. We need more dating, we need a lot more interaction between archaeologists and historians to try to merge that. And we need local studies. One at the bottom is a man who decided to investigate Telford's Road between Kindusi and the road to Speenbridge, and he just went and documented every single bridge along the way. And that's what we see here. He's numbered them and taken pictures, and really valuable, very simple, but really valuable work. So, in conclusion, can you help with this picture? What research projects have been done? Where can we get this information? You probably know about lots more that I haven't even mentioned that's important. Help get the HER up to date. We have an initiative to adopt an HER record. You can basically take one and make sure you can put pictures and information. What key objects do you think we should be looking at? Where do you see our gaps? And there's certainly opportunities for new research, whether it's large, small, or even dissertations. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Susan, thank you very much for such an amazing sweep through 2,000 years of history. Almost to time, indeed. So that's so there is an opportunity for questions if folks have any, and I'm sure you do have. What I think I'll do is I'll open it up to the floor first, then we'll let folks in VC land have a shot, and then we'll come back to the floor to finish up. So first of all, any questions from around the floor? Yes.
Susan, these watch houses that overlooked graveyards or cemeteries, how would you recognise them? One, would they be like a little shed?
They're a freestanding building that's there. I mean, there's usually a local tradition with it, but they're more than a shed, and they're often, 2 stories often, because you have to be able to watch out. I mean, there is some variation in them, but yes.
And would they have been throughout beyond the Highlands? Or
yes, you do find them elsewhere as well, yeah.
And would they have been manned just at night or
manned just after a body had been buried? And as a result of that, that's the time that you're most at risk. I mean, there are other things. You would also have
You talked about the lack of bodies.
in the early Iron Age, yes.
And way in the past. What was the population?
We don't know.
So
In order to have that, you need to have a cemetery. And that's what we don't have. And we can't even assume, even in prehistory, that we have all the people there. So when we're talking early Iron Age there, we simply have no idea of that. But the fact that we have virtually no bodies suggests that they must have a different burial tradition. And I mean, I always throw this open to the Young Archaeologists Club, which I do, and I sort of say, okay, give me a burial rite that will leave no trace. And they think for a while, and inevitably they always go, cannibalism. But
You still have the bones.
well, I don't know. I mean, but it could be you just left the bodies out. Maybe the religious belief it didn't matter, so the animals could go. Water's the other one. Maybe you floated them out, and maybe that. But whatever it is, there is a tradition that's going that doesn't. Now it gets more complicated because there are a few bodies, but they often have holes drilled in them. So there'll be just one or two bones with a hole that's been deliberately drilled into them, and whether this is tokens, whether it's, again, it's a picture that's, it's complicated.
I enjoyed that, thank you. You said at the beginning that the SCARF project is still in year one
That's right.
of 3 years, and year one is data collection.
That's right.
What are you doing in years 2 and 3? I mean, are you developing a range of thematic approaches, for instance?
Well, it's more trying to gather the evidence there. I mean, trying to, now that once we get the data, then we can start doing simple things like doing distribution maps. Where are you finding certain key objects? Where are you finding key types? Where are you finding the brocks? And so it's a question then of synthesis, of trying to get that, bringing it out to panels. So we have a steering group that represents various other ones and trying to get those to input, getting texts out to have people read them and comment on them. So the end result is this overview, is to try to do that. So, I mean, we will slip into the beginning of year 2, we'll still be doing some data as well.
So because you're linking it through to the HERs and the HER and the planning departments, those texts, will they then develop as sort of research strategic documents?
They can do. We will be each of the chronological periods will generate some research questions. And so with those research questions, you would think that, okay, if I'm trying to get funding for a project, if it comes up in the SCARF, you've got a better argument. And so there's a lot of people already thematically. For example, one of the things we're encountering is that no online catalogues in museums. It would be really good to have online catalogues of our museums. And we're thinking we'll make sure that goes into the SCARF so that then if there's a project to get all the catalogues online, they've got the arguments that are there to show it. So it's both a synthesis, but also showing the gaps, and those gaps can help perhaps find the funding and perhaps find the will to solve them later. So
this is the strength of your community base, really, that the research questions are coming out of what people here are studying and putting into the HER. So you said there was funding from Historic Environment Scotland,
that's right.
But they're not top-down questions from Edinburgh saying,
nope.
Here you are, you nice people.
No. And that's why we deliberately are saying, okay, you tell us, what do we need to know? I think, to be fair, the National SCARF wasn't just Edinburgh, but it was very much such a broad sweep that they were doing in an overview in such a large area. So they were taking the large research questions, but we have the option now to take the local research questions. What's happening in Northwest Sutherland? This is a clear one for every single period. And yet there are these odd sites that are coming up, but we can go really local on that and try to incorporate those in. But my view is the more people we have contributing, reading, commenting, the stronger this is going to be at the end. I would also like to see at the end that we have not only this Wikipedia, the wiki format, but we also get a book out of this. It would be nice just to have an overview of everything we know about Highland archaeology, and Highland heritage in one place. So for 2021, this is the state of what we know, with pictures.
It would be the first since the Royal Commission of Historical Monuments.
Sorry?
The first survey after the Royal Commission of Historical Monuments.
Yes.
A long time ago.
Well, yes. I mean, that was a long time ago.
Then yourself first, and then yourself.
You mentioned no lack of monastic evidence in Dornoch. I've talked to old men who worked up building council houses at the top, and they said that there were rather strange buildings that they thought could have been sort of cells and so on. when they built Bishopfield.
You've got a name, yeah. I mean, a lot of time, you always have to have a bit of skepticism on this, because a number of nunneries I've heard about, which are not nunneries at all. It's really, the documentary evidence is key, and that's what we're lacking in a lot of times.
But by the fact there seemed to be some built something up there.
We need excavation and dating evidence, don't we? Yeah.
Under the same umbrella just round the corner at Archanchata, the building houses at the moment on the hill, which is, as far as I'm concerned, is covered and stuff, including a double cyst on the top. I mean, if you were at the Robin Museum, you would have seen a beaker that came from there.
Yeah.
And they're still marching on, destroying today as well.
I don't know the site, so I can't tell. I would hope that one of the conditions on the planning was that it would be investigated before the building, but I don't know.
Investigated. I had a look when the archaeologists were there and saw some things. But he said they were only medieval, which I thought was a bit weak. But I saw some rather odd-looking things.
Yes.
And so stones, but not the dug away the other side of the hill.
Yeah.
They're heading up towards the double cyst at the top. I mean, to me, pathetic that kind of thing still goes on.
Yes, I mean, I don't know that situation, but the hope is that the more information we get in means that when a planning application comes up, that they do insist on doing further excavation.
Well, basically, leading on from that, there's actually another case found in old forest just across a quarter mile on the other side of it. So there's a potential lot there.
Yeah, so you.
And if someone dismisses, an archaeologist dismisses something as just medieval around here, I want to know why. One question I asked was, you talk about community archaeology projects. How do they go about that? Where does funding come from, or is it? Because there's one thing I think unusual in medieval, you might say, irrigation system, taking water, the monks ditch, taking from the eaglets to the head and bottom of the Dornoch Barn. There's a survey done by the Dornoch Heritage of the eaglets, so there's some basic mention of it there. But we've no attempt. We're assuming it's Benedictine, because the first bishop here, which you mentioned, going through, though he wasn't based in Dornoch, he was a lot of time with King David. You can see he witnessed a lot of charters. But King David was keen on spreading more regular types of government Chaldee, both Europeans there. When you mentioned just with a social club or what, so this community centre, there was a projecting wing that was put on to the school in 1903. Dr. Scott, I think you can find online his survey of the North of Scotland, his archaeological sites, when he was in Dornoch, spoke to a Dr. Grant, who was present when that was through, and he said they found two types of stonework, one dry stone, which was from the earlier one, and other squared and mortar, which was two-phase.
These are good examples of local studies that really could be brought together and just summarised and then fed into this. I mean, that's what we really need, is people who are on the ground who are concerned to do that. That's the one answer, I think, to part of your question. The other is, how do you get these community projects off the go? And it's with a lot of work. That basically you need to do funding. There's certain funding streams. The Heritage Lottery Fund is one. There are a couple others that are there. Historic Environment Scotland, obviously. But for each one of these, you need a plan. And it depends if your project's going to be digging. That adds a real extra issue, because you won't know what you're going to get until you dig. But you have to have enough of the budget to pay for the post-excavation, because there's no point digging if you're not going to be able to preserve your finds. And so therefore, digging is a harder one to do. But in terms of getting people together to work and discover and research, and that's the sort of thing that Arch does all the time. And it's basically, we do funding from various numbers of sources. Wind farm sources, again, is another good source. And you tend to just pull these together. But what you need is, as long as you have a project with a good question, it's ultimately, that's the key. And people who are prepared to do a lot of the unglamorous work behind the scenes in terms of getting these things off the ground.
Could I ask a follow on? Test pits. I believe the big dig, which was many years ago on Channel 4, the time team, that was it. They did various times. Are these still favoured, a coordinated version of people working? Because we don't know what the final extent of Dornoch was. We know what it's probably an economic contraction compared to the Middle Ages.
What you have there is a question, and then you have to decide what the best way to answer that. You can't strip all of Dornoch down.
No,
so therefore, test pits are going to give you some indication, but you also need to do a lot of work about where your metal detector finds are coming from, where your documentary evidence. It's really a question of doing an overall survey and working from there. But even remember that finds that you find on fields outside of Dornoch doesn't necessarily mean that's where the occupation is. That's the midden. They've been taken out and put onto the fields. So it's a complicated picture.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm aware of time is pushing in on us, so just give a chance for folks out there in VC land to ask any questions if they have them, and then we'll come back for one last question on the floor. So if you have a really pressing question, now is the time to be holding on to it. Okay, anybody got a question out there in VC land? I'm hoping that I've only got the mute on one side. That's what I'm hoping, anyway. I don't think anybody's trying to speak to us anyway. So
they could wave to you if they want.
Yeah, they could indeed wave to me. Yeah, so I'm assuming not. That's my hope. So if it was, apologies. So, chance for then one final question for Susan before we wrap up.
Can I just point out, I've got leaflets here if you're interested in helping, if you want to know about how to contribute. They're just on the stand there, so do take one and just get in touch.
Okay, so before we close, and thanks Susan for one final time, I just want to thank you all again for coming. It's a fantastic turnout. Some total strangers to us, which is lovely to see. Our next talk comes up, well, at the moment it's scheduled for early May, and looks at a whole new type of, or a whole new sphere of material culture from Southeast Asia. So if that interests you and you want to be informed about when talks are happening, we have a sign-up list, I believe, somewhere going around. Fantastic. So please stay, sign up, leave your contact details, and we'll be in touch. But again, thank you very much for coming, one and all. And indeed, thank you to Susan again for such a really great talk. Thank you. And thank you very much for everybody who came in by VC. Lovely to see you. Bye-bye now.
This call has been disconnected. Thank you for joining.